endless months of waiting for a verdict are now over, and the verdict is in. For real this time. Officer Darren Wilson, who killed the teenager Michael Brown, will not be indicted. The jury came to a unanimous decision that Wilson acted in an appropriate manner and has done nothing wrong. The country is rightfully outraged as they feel this is a very serious miscarriage of justice. Once again, the police of the American white colonizer nation have killed a young black man with impunity. The prosecutor for this case was Robert McCullough. Now, originally, what he had done was they had scheduled at the time to release this information at about 6 p.m. EST. Of course, I had been watching since then in anticipation of trying to cover it, as I did give a live tweeting coverage over on Twitter. But it took a very, very long time for them to actually get to announcing to the public what the verdict had actually been. They had known for some time, this almost the entire day, or even yesterday, who knows how long they actually knew. Everybody had gone home, the jurors were gone, most everybody who was affiliated with this was made aware of what was going on, except of course for Michael Brown's parents. They were not informed, and most probably, even though they had told them that they would be, they probably would have told the media in some way, shape, or form, and I think that's why they didn't tell them. But it seemed very strange how they kept waiting to give out the information. They waited almost 3.5 hours. It wasn't until around 9:30 Eastern Standard Time that they actually released the verdict. And as you know, the verdict was that Officer Darren Wilson will not face any charges for his actions regarding the killing of Michael Brown. Now, CNN, which was the channel I was watching for all this coverage, had Mark O'Mara as their legal analyst. And if you'll recall, he was the lawyer for George Zimmerman. And he had some very interesting comments for this entire period that we were waiting to find out what happened. Now, O'Mara did note that this should not have taken anywhere near this long. It should not have taken 3.5 months. It should have been nowhere near that. And he said in all his time, he has never heard of a grand jury decision taking this long, or the information being presented to the grand jury. And the part of that was because they overwhelmed them with so much evidence. They gave them a pile, and I'm sure they went through all of that and properly did it, but they were bombarded with an awful lot of information. Now, he said normally in these cases, a grand jury decision, they actually don't give very much evidence. They actually give like a bare bones kind of thing, just enough for them to come to a decision whether or not to go ahead and press charges or what it is that they are going to decide. And the real evidence, the real heavy substance would be coming out in the trial itself to determine the guilt. He also did note that if this were a civilian case, like this had not been a police officer involved, it would not have taken anywhere near the amount of time that it actually did. It actually would have been very short, open and shut, maybe 1 or 2 days at the most. Yet, because this is a police officer, it suspiciously took so long. This police shooting doesn't really seem any different than any other we've seen. And that alone speaks kind of suspicious to me that they went through this whole process and had an incredible number of witnesses on both sides. Now, before the prosecutor actually said what the grand jury's decision had actually been, we had known for some time, because it had been said by CNN, that if actually he was going to be indicted for something, he would have been arrested before it was publicly announced that they had reached the decision. And because of that, and then a communication from people that they say were close to Darren Wilson that he was still free and moving around, it seemed very likely that he was not going to be indicted at all. So almost like 45 minutes ahead of the actual time that it was made public, it seemed very likely that he was not going to be indicted. Then after that indictment and much before it, the prosecutor spoke to a lot of the evidence that was actually presented in the case. And there he essentially, in many roundabout ways, made certain accusations and said certain things in a particular way. For example, the prosecutor repeatedly blamed the media for a lot of the, what some would call hysteria surrounding the case. And he argued that a lot of the counterfactual information actually came from media and social media that made things more difficult for them to proceed with their job. So it seems like by the very nature that people knew it was happening and were able to get information out, either via the mainstream media or social media, that his job, as a result, became much more difficult. And then when you listen on to more about what it is that he said, he talked about the inaccuracy of the witnesses who sided with Michael Brown. Kept saying that they changed their stories, or they admitted that they hadn't seen what it is they claimed to see, they had only heard somebody say, and continually made disparaging remarks against the witnesses on Brown's side, but said very little of what the witnesses on Wilson's side actually had to say. In fact, they had been kept out of the media. They didn't speak to reporters at all. I mean, there was very, very little actually broadcast on what witnesses who corroborate Wilson's side of the story actually said. And most of them just completely kept their mouths shut and spoke in this situation. And I actually find that pretty suspicious, because we're not going to know, at least for some time, what exactly was said once all this evidence, this information, is put out to the public. In another interesting moment, the lawyer or a person from the Police Services Board who said that he knew Wilson spoke to CNN on more than one occasion during the broadcast, and what he had said was he had cast a lot of disparaging remarks upon the lawyer for the Brown family, or the things that he said specifically. But something very interesting came out of his mouth. He had said, even if he's found not guilty, like he's not indicted, he's not a killer, a murderer. He changed his word halfway. And I really think that actually might be a real Freudian slip in the real meaning of what it is what that actually means. Like he had accidentally said something he actually meant, or was actually thinking, instead of what he had meant to say, what he had prepared for the public. And I do think in some way that's what the police really believe, that this isn't really a killing, that these people are just animals to them, and that doing this is no different than euthanizing an animal or working on a farm and all the kinds of things that are done involving the slaughter of animals there. And I think that actually speaks to a real part of the mentality the police has, given the fact that this guy is a part of the Police Services Board. Another very telling moment was when he spoke in defense of his fellow officers who have been out on the streets ever since this went down. He claimed that during 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks after the killing incident had actually taken place, he said protesters repeatedly tried to kill officers. Well, I would like to have some kind of source for that, or something to back that up. But think about what he's actually saying. He's accusing the population of attempted murder, while he's actually defending a guy who actually killed somebody. Just think about that. The public is guilty in his mind of attempted murder, which he's already passed judgment on. But the guy who's actually killed someone, well, he doesn't really have anything to say about that other than, I know the guy, he couldn't have done it, his story must be right. Another interesting moment was when the mayor of Ferguson opened the press conference up to questions. A member of Revolution News from the Avakian Revolutionary Communist Party managed to get a question in. He asked why African Americans should feel safe on the streets of Ferguson if Wilson was not indicted. However, the mayor predictably dodged the question. I give credit to Revolution News for managing to force their question in when they would have otherwise been silenced. One of the side notes, the little pieces of humanistic material that the media put forward just to put a little human face on this, and I'm sure as a bit of propaganda, they were talking about Darren Wilson and what his personal life has been like during this time. And they noted that despite everything that was going on, Darren Wilson got married in the last few weeks, and he married another officer in the force. Both of them have a previous marriage, divorced, what have you. So, meanwhile, while the Brown family is grieving for the loss of their son, and Michael Brown is lying dead in the street because of him, he is having what's supposed to be the happiest day of his life, even knowing that he faced a possible indictment for murder, which he could be charged, tried, and then sentenced. Yet he didn't really feel like this was a threat that was actually against him. And the media was also saying that he had not been seen publicly, that he'd been keeping a low profile. I certainly understand. but he certainly had the time to get married while everybody else was grieving. NAACP CEO and President William Brooks appeared on Wolf Blitzer's show as the world was waiting for the verdict. Speaking to him, I have lost, while he was speaking to him, I was listening to it, I lost a tremendous amount of respect for the NAACP. It seemed like Brooks had gone out there entirely to justify the police actions of suppressing the population and their righteous anger against this injustice that had happened. He went out there constantly saying that we don't need violence. There are ways to get reforms. I'm sure these are the same reforms he was talking about, or his colleagues in the NAACP were talking about 30 years ago, that haven't really manifested. There hasn't been any serious change since the 1960s or possibly the 1970s. He kept going on telling how the people who were really angry at us were completely wrong. Oh, you're angry, I understand that, but don't go ahead and do anything about it. And by do anything about it, actually try to accomplish something. He essentially argued the same old liberal line. Just don't argue. Just hold a sign, tell everyone you're angry, just don't take what you need. And there was really a tone about him where he was just not giving. It seemed like he didn't care that the guy, Michael Brown, had actually been killed. His entire focus actually seemed to be on attacking people who rioted, who rose up angrily, rather than the systemic police violence that's constantly carried out against the African American population. And that just completely blew my mind. What's this guy's job? Is he fighting for the rights of African Americans? Or is his job to justify violence against African Americans by the police? Now, a few days before this, before the verdict was made public, U.S. President Barack Obama spoke to ABC News in an exclusive interview that was broadcast on Friday, urging calm in the area. As expected, he called for peace and nonviolence and to allow justice to run its course.
First and foremost, keep protests peaceful. This is a country that allows everybody to express their views, but using any event as an excuse for violence is contrary to rule of law and contrary to who we are.
In Ferguson,
part of what I've asked Eric Holder to do is to not just engage with the folks in Ferguson, but to engage nationally in a conversation between law enforcement and communities of color that oftentimes feel as if they are not being treated fairly by law enforcement officials. Sometimes their concerns are justified. Sometimes they're not justified. Law enforcement has a very tough job to be sensitive to the concerns of minority communities. Then over time, trust can be built, in part because minority communities typically are subject to more crime. They need law enforcement more than anybody. And there are a lot of communities in my hometown of Chicago, for example, who actually want to see more police in, but they want to make sure that the police are trained so they can distinguish between a gangbanger and a kid who just happens to be wearing a hoodie, but otherwise is a good kid and not doing anything wrong.
This, of course, is a very regular, everyday statement that you get from politicians. Don't do anything, just sit back and the system will prosecute itself, essentially. So this is not the America where we simply get mad and do something about it. Like, this is not what we do. We just don't get violent. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the African American population being killed? That is the problem. Violence is the problem. This is a one-sided slaughter. The police slaughtering the black masses. So how can you tell them not to use violence? You're essentially telling them not to defend themselves. Just let the police beat you up, and then the system will magically work, and you'll just go free because you didn't do anything wrong. I mean, the incarceration rates, the greater penalties for the same crime, all of those statistics, proven facts, don't mean anything in this situation, according to Obama, because the justice system just works. You don't have to get mad. You don't have to smash it. You don't need to use violence against the people who just use violence against you. It is absolutely ridiculous. And correct me if I'm wrong, again, but isn't violence the foundation of the United States? Isn't the violence carried out against the oppression by the king or the taxes the whole reason why? Wasn't violence towards an injustice committed against people the very foundation of the United States? Isn't that the myth that we're always told? Well, it certainly is. But it would seem in this case, because it's a young black man who was killed by authority, it's not righteous. It's only really righteous when white people don't want to pay taxes to a king. Speaking of racial inequality, black Americans are not fairly represented in society, nor were they in this case. Although Ferguson, Missouri is 67.4% black, the grand jury, despite the claim of the prosecutor, did not reflect this. Instead, they had 3 blacks and 9 whites. Some people argue, yes, but the grand jury is in Clayton. But it's supposed to represent Ferguson. This is not a proper representation of the city. This, in and of itself, is actually an insult, particularly when the prosecutor later on claimed that the jury was a fair representation of the city. Now, immediately following this presentation by the prosecutor, they went live to U.S. President Barack Obama, who had specific statements that he wanted to make on this situation. And frankly, I do want to warn you, some of them are the worst excuses for the fascism the police have pulled, and I've heard in a very long time.
As all of you know, a few minutes ago, the grand jury deliberating the death of Michael Brown issued its decision. It's now come that either way was going to be subject of intense disagreement, not only in Ferguson, but across America. So I just want to say a few words suggesting how we might move forward. First and foremost, we are a nation built on the rule of law. And so we need to accept that this decision was the grand jury's to make. There are Americans who agree with it, and there are Americans who are deeply disappointed, even angry. To the law enforcement officials in Ferguson and the region to show care and restraint in managing peaceful protests that may occur. Understand, our police officers put their lives on the line for us every single day. They've got a tough job to do, to maintain public safety and hold accountable those who break the law. In too many parts of this country, a deep distrust exists between law enforcement and communities of color. Some of this is the result of the legacy of racial discrimination in this country. And this is tragic because nobody needs good policing more than poor communities with higher crime rates. The good news is we know there are things we can do to help. It's enormous progress in race relations over the course of the past several decades. I have witnessed that in my own life. And to deny that progress, I think, is to deny America's capacity for change. But what is also true is that there are still problems, and communities of color aren't just making these problems up. Separating that from this particular decision, there are issues in which the law too often feels as if it is being applied in a discriminatory fashion. I don't think that's the norm. I don't think that's true for the majority of communities or the vast majority of law enforcement officials, but these are real issues. And we have to lift them up and not deny them or try to tamp them down. What we need to do is to understand them and figure out how do we make more progress. And that can be done. That won't be done by throwing bottles. That won't be done by smashing car windows. That won't be done by using this as an excuse to vandalize property.
These statements are, frankly, absolutely ridiculous. This is a complete attempt to disarm the black population from the terrible crimes that are being committed against it, and he's aiding them every step of the way. And that's very clear. It's ridiculous. Now, of course, once this was over, the protesters stayed there, and many of them started to leave after the decision was made public. But that wasn't enough. Once those who wanted to stay and protest refused to move, then the Ferguson police initiated violence. They began shooting tear gas canisters. There have been claims of smoke grenades as well, and all kinds of other things, concussion grenades. But it was very interesting how this violence was actually instigated by the police when people didn't want to move, when they wanted to stay there and protest against what has been happening to them for all these decades. It was the police who came out and enacted violence. And of course, from there, when that happens, this kind of thing always escalates and becomes bigger and bigger. Cars were set on fire, stores were looted, even stores were set on fire. One protester talking to CNN said, "They have us boxed in and are refusing to let us leave, but then they're also telling us to leave and then firing tear gas at us when we don't because we can't." I mean, this was not even limited to merely just protesters who were getting shot with beanbags and gassed. They were also hitting the media, and the media was suffering as a result of this. Police even gassed them to make them leave particular places. And police, they ordered a safe disbursement. They ordered people to disperse safely, but they're shooting at them at the same time. I mean, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The police are very clearly the aggressors in this situation. Now, regardless of how this situation turns out, regardless of what's going to happen, whether he had been indicted or whether Wilson hadn't been, nothing would have essentially changed. All of the repression that African Americans face from police forces would have absolutely continued unabated. I mean, it is just going to go on. And if anything, it might actually get worse for African Americans because the police are going to be mad at the protesters for protesting. I mean, police are supposed to be there to protect your rights, to serve and protect. Yet they seem to get very, very mad at you when you demonstrate those rights, exercise those rights, actually protest, especially when you protest them. And that has to force a lot of people to start really reconsidering what it is that they think of the police. And that really this serve and protect is property. It's only really property that the police actually care about. That is their main focus. They say we're here to protect property and protect people. I didn't see anybody getting protected. I saw a lot of people getting hit by beanbag bullets, getting gassed, getting clubbed. But I did see a lot of attempts to protect property. I did see that. Well, it just seems like one of these claims made by the police was actually correct and the other was not. And what we have to do, finally, understand that the police are not going to police themselves. You cannot rely on the bourgeois system to prosecute its own bodyguards. That's what the police are there for. You cannot ask the system to police itself. It's going to require some kind of external force in order to accomplish that. And even just now, reports are coming in about parties that white people in certain demographics are cheering about. They're glad that he got off with this, that he wasn't going to be prosecuted, that Darren Wilson is going to walk free. And they're having parties. I've heard rumors about KKK parties that are going on right after that was announced. And a lot of white liberal weaklings are standing there saying, oh, justice wasn't done, but we'll get them next time, and stop rioting because you're just making things worse. Don't get angry. Get involved. And by get involved, they mean do something that's completely useless and won't actually accomplish anything. And this speaks a lot to, I think, to the third worldist position. That while there are some people in the first world who have revolutionary potential, like the Indian nation and the black nation, particularly the black nation, it's not enough. While black people are oppressed, and they genuinely need to rise up against and revolt against those who are oppressing them, particularly the white colonizer settler nation, they can't overall get that victory. At the most, the black masses could liberate themselves. But could they bring a revolution to the United States? No. That's beyond their power to do. Why? Because the white nation will attempt to stop them. I mean, we can sit here and argue all we want about the revolutionary potential that does or doesn't exist in the first world, particularly the United States. But any time a righteous anger is expressed by African Americans, white people come out and they absolutely denounce it. The outright overt racists come out and they attack black people for standing up for themselves. No, get back down, shut up, there's nothing wrong, you're not suffering, you're an animal, blah, blah, blah. But then you get the white liberals who claim to want to help, who say, don't smash anything. We're doing our best to help you. We filed a motion in X court that will get heard in about 3 months so that we can discuss the item further and then have another hearing and then another hearing. And in the meantime, 100 or so of these offenses continue. The white people just don't want black people to rise up, even when they claim to be on their side. And this is another true reality of the whole white settler nation that we have to understand. White people are never going to help you. Never. Because there was no revolutionary potential in the first world white people. There's some pockets of it. There are some people who have revolutionary potential, but there's no significant revolutionary potential. There is not enough to actually overthrow the system that is wrong. African Americans really do need to be very careful who they let into their resistance movements or their resistance actions, even if they are, spontaneous reactions of anger like smashing things. But this does prove another third worldist point that you cannot rely on white people to help bring revolution to the black masses, because it's just not going to happen. White people are generally overwhelmingly unrevolutionary in the first world. There's nothing they can do, and there's nothing they're willing to do. And when some other nation tries to rise up, you either have the overt reactionaries that attack them and oppress them, like the Bundy Ranch thing kind of people, or you get white liberals complaining about the use of violence, saying, don't do that, it makes you look bad, it makes us look bad, which is very easy for the person who's not being shot and killed in the streets to say. It's quite another when you're the person who's actually the victim of it. And this shows that while there is clearly a revolutionary potential among African Americans, it's not big enough. They can probably bring revolution to themselves, their own liberation, but they cannot overthrow the U.S. government. They simply don't have the capacity to do that. This is why the third world cannot rely on first world people. And this is why, even though there are people in the first world with revolutionary potential, there is not enough of them to make any serious difference. And this is why all power must be sent to the third world. By all means, help your black brothers and sisters in their struggle. But understand, it can't bring revolution to the country. At best, it can only bring their own liberation, which is why we, third worldists, believe all power to the third world. By all means, resistance in the first world, revolution in the third. But just keep in mind, the revolution is not going to happen here. Because in the end, you need the white people in order to have a revolution in the country. And the white people just simply refuse to fight.